Good morning. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Today we are on lesson 16 of Paul's second epistle to Corinth, and we're covering 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 13 through 24. This one's called Paul's Contagious Heart for Jerusalem. As Christians in the United States, we are among the most prosperous people in the world. As stated in a previous lesson, if we make more than $10,000 a year, we are wealthier than 84% of the people in the world. John D. Rockefeller, who was the wealthiest man in the early 1900s, was asked how much money was enough, and he answered, "Just a little more than I have." That seems to be accurate, even though we are warned that it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter heaven. That does not say it is impossible, as nothing is impossible with God. Some pastors repeat an age-old myth that to enter Jerusalem, a camel had to pass through a narrow opening that was called the eye of the needle. And that is what this verse was referencing. But there's no scriptural or historical report of that. Some pastor probably got that info from his old wife, and hence it became an old wives' tale. It is easy to see the scriptural admonishment that analogy describes, as we also are told that the love of money is the root of all evil, along with this admonishment from Matthew 6, verses 19 through 21. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. An earthly adage is to save it for a rainy day. As in all of our lives, difficulties will arise. And with that emphasis, some of our saving should also be for the rainy days in the lives of others. With a reminder that this chapter already has discussed that Paul had been taking up a collection for the believers in Jerusalem who were under heavy persecution. Let's read today's first passage. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 13 through 15 says this: For I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened, but by an equality, that now at this time your abundance may supply their lack, that their abundance also may supply your lack, that there may be equality. As it is written, he who gathered much had nothing left over, and he who gathered little had no lack. Certainly Paul was not asking Corinth to go without, so that others would have an overabundance. Don't go into debt to pay someone else's debt. That sounds more like the message preached by Kenneth Copeland, Benny Hinn, and the like. In 2015, Benny Hinn repeated one of the false prophecies he'd used before, first used in the 1990s. In that false prophecy, he told the people that God was going to financially bless Christians within the next couple months, and the blessing would come from unbelievers. It would be a transfer of wealth similar to when the Jews left Egypt and they departed with gold, silver, and other possessions of the Egyptians. In Benny Hinn's prophecy, he also said that God was going to save all of the unsaved loved ones they had been praying for as well. But the only Christians receiving these would be the ones who sowed the seed. This is prosperity gospel parlance for donating money to the prophecy giver. Hinn prophesied that the return would occur within 2 months, and at that time, God would give the person their sowed seed tenfold. For an example, for those who gave Hinn $10,000, within 2 months, God would put $100,000 in the hands of that giver. Of course, in the 1990s, when Hinn originally gave this prophecy, no return occurred. The only one to benefit was Hinn. And even though he knew it was a false prophecy, as it did not happen as he said it would, it benefited him enough financially that Hinn decided to recycle the same false prophecy 25 years later. It was a false prophecy the second time too. Imagine the number of people who follow Hinn who donated to Hinn as much money as they could get their hands on. Many became immediately impoverished, but they believed they would be wealthy in a couple months. Some certainly gave out of their poverty. The poor became poorer, and the rich became richer, as it lined the pockets of hen. Hen certainly is not going to inherit the earth. To me, the saddest part is that these followers cannot be very smart, or they wouldn't follow hen. But sadly, many will feel burned by God rather than burned by hen, and will turn away from Jesus. But if the only reason they follow Jesus is for earthly wealth, they really don't know Jesus. The Bible states that one false prophecy makes a person a false prophet, and also states this. Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 20 through 22 says, "But the prophet who presumes to speak a word in my name, which I have not commanded him to speak, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die. And if you say in your heart, how shall we know the word which the Lord has not spoken? When a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if the thing does not happen or come to pass, that is the thing which the Lord has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. You shall not be afraid of him." The third commandment tells us not to use God's name in vain. And though many people identify this as using God's name with a curse, it also applies to attributing something to God that he did not say. When these false prophets attribute these prophecies to God, when they did not come from God, they are speaking under their own authority rather than God's authority. But I've gotten a little bit sidetracked here. This passage deals with God's calling for us to help others. Certainly, God has the power to handle that without our help. But at the same time, God has chosen to use us in the process. He draws us closer to other believers in this manner. Paul referred to those who gathered much but had nothing left over, and those who gathered little and still had an abundance. We should notice a few aspects of this. First of all, regardless of how much had been gathered, both of these groups still had enough to survive. But what we can see is the group that gathered little seems to have more remaining than the group who gathered much. Those with much money can spend so much they don't even know where it's going, while those with less are typically more focused on staying within a budget. This made me think of God's daily provision of manna to the Israelites in their 40 years in the wilderness. In the morning, the manna would be on the ground, just as the dew, and they were instructed to not gather more than they needed. If they did not eat what they gathered, it would rot before the next day, except on the Sabbath, when the manna that was gathered before the Sabbath would last for 2 days. God still is Jehovah Jireh, the God who provides. This is the name that Abraham gave to the location where God had provided a substitute sacrifice for Isaac. Let's read the next passage. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 16 through 21 says this, "But thanks be to God who puts the same earnest care for you into the heart of Titus. For he not only accepted the exhortation, but being more diligent, he went to you of his own accord. And we have sent with him the brother whose praise is in the gospel throughout all the churches. And not only that, but who was also chosen by the churches to travel with us with this gift, which is administered by us to the glory of the Lord himself, and to show your ready mind, avoiding this, that anyone should blame us in this lavish gift which is administered by us, providing honorable things, not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of men." Who accompanied Titus to Corinth? Paul does not identify him, but Paul described him with the attribute that he shared the gospel throughout the churches. Most think that this was referring to Luke, the author of the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. Luke was a close associate of Paul, and it is likely that Paul had been the one who initially had shared the gospel with Luke. Titus and this other unnamed servant of the Lord, possibly Luke, had gone to Corinth with hearts of grace and love rather than hearts of judgment to help Corinth get back on the right path. The gift referred to here, once again, was the money that was being collected and added to, designated for the believers in Jerusalem, who were being persecuted more than the others. Personally, this makes me think of other Christians around the world now in our time. At the top of the list are the believers in North Korea, where a person claiming to be a Christian is given a death sentence by the law, or at the very least, a harsh prison sentence. It's very difficult for us to help them, but it's not impossible. There are ministries that smuggle provisions like food and medicine, Bibles, and money to the believers in North Korea. One of the lessons here is that we should not grow complacent based on the level of persecution where we live. But complacent is exactly what most of us have become. Each of us has no trouble finding a Bible or going to a local church. Few Christians continue to read the Bible, though we can carry the Bible around in our cell phones. In North Korea, some people have nothing more than the Bible verses they've memorized. We take so much for granted. In addition to North Korea, the believers in Muslim countries also face much persecution. Most of us in the United States focus on family, but brothers and sisters in the body of Christ are family members for all of eternity. We might not meet them until we get to heaven, but we are united with them while still on this earth. Let's read the final passage today. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 22 through 24 says this, "And we have sent with them our brother, whom we have often proved diligent in many things, but now much more diligent, because of the great confidence which we have in you. If anyone inquires about Titus, he is my partner and fellow worker concerning you. Or if our brethren are inquired about, they are messengers of the churches, the glory of Christ. Therefore show to them and before the churches the proof of your love and of our boasting on your behalf." Titus and likely Luke had spent an extended period of time with the people at the church of Corinth already. In this passage, Paul reminded those people to love Titus in return, as obviously Titus had shown them much love. Titus was with Paul when he wrote this letter, and Paul would send Titus back to Corinth again to deliver this epistle of 2 Corinthians. And until Paul delivered this collection to Jerusalem, he would continue to collect as much as he could. Most of us as believers are faced with numerous requests to support a variety of ministries. We need to prayerfully consider these, though there are times when I've made decisions based on past performance before ever getting to prayer. There are many people like Hen and Copeland who are trying to line their own pockets, though their ministries claim something different. But as stated in a previous lesson, give to give, don't give to get. If we're giving based on our own benefit, especially financially, that is a business decision rather than one made in faith. Our faith points to God using that donation for the benefit of another, while continuing to provide for our needs as he already has been doing. God has made no promises that we will skate through this world without any difficulties. Instead, Jesus said, "In this world you will have tribulation, but alas, be of good cheer, I have overcome the world." Paul wrote of huge difficulties he faced, and that included lack of these basic provisions. 2 Corinthians 11:27 tells us, "In weariness and toil, in sleeplessness often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness." Perhaps the biggest lesson is not to equate our wealth or poverty with God's provision based on how we follow him. This means that we are not wealthy because we follow God well, and poor because we don't. Is there any chance that Paul was not doing more for the Lord than any of us? And still, he did without food, drink, and the proper clothing. Along the same lines, when someone is wealthy, does that mean they're doing everything to please God, and in turn he is blessing them? All we have to do is to look at the lives of many wealthy people who claim to be atheists and see the pervasiveness of sin in their lives to know that wealth does not equate with God's blessing. In some ways, it might be a bigger blessing to have less and learn to count on God's provision than to be wealthy and think that we have accomplished that on our own. Whatever our place, though, be content where God places us. And also realize that we are not alone. We have fellow members of God's family, and we should show our love for others. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Have a blessed day.